Squint.
This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the Rassie Erasmus of website builders, a site that makes designing your own website for you so quick, so easy, so simple. Anyone can do it, especially with their new design intelligence system, very much following Rassie's own approach, combining 2 decades of expertise to empower those around him. For one, it's to beat Argentina very comfortably in the Rugby Championship. For the other, it's to use cutting-edge technology and AI to tailor a personalised website to your, yes, you in particular's needs. Everything updated with one keystroke or click of a button, able to implement text and design across the entire website to your precise tastes, a la the Springboks system changing when Sasha slots in at 10 ahead of Pollard, say. And if you want to save some money on using this design intelligence system and the other magnificent features of Squarespace, please head to the link in the description and use the offer code SquidRugby to save yourself some money. 3 World Cups, 2 Rugby Championships, 1 Curry Cup, 1 Freedom Cup, runner-up in Super Rugby and the Pro 12. And that's just so far. Over the last 15 years, pretty good Springbok flanker from the 90s, Johan Erasmus, has grown into one of rugby's true cultural icons. A man who stirs up opinion, love, emotions with just one word, one name. Rassie. Just over a week ago, Springbok head coach Erasmus' side celebrated yet another milestone moment as they demolished Argentina to win the Rugby Championship on home soil. The team somehow looking drastically better than when they won the bloody World Cup last year. And yet, that win also raised a few questions. Just what got Erasmus to this all-conquering position? Just how good at bloody coaching is he? And perhaps most tantalising of all, where does he deserve to be ranked amongst the greatest coaches in the history of rugby union football? We started off by reflecting on where Rassie sits amongst his own proud countrymen. I think it's a pretty inarguable fact that Rassie Erasmus is, at this point, South Africa's greatest ever coach.
It's hard to argue with that. I think that, on one hand, he's the one guy who's got them 2 World Cups, right?
The only coach ever to win 2 World Cups as a head coach.
Yeah. Even though you could argue that Jacques Nienaber was the head coach in 2023.
That's true, actually. No, you're right.
Let's be honest, they both were for both
But
World
also,
Cups.
he was there for 2007 as well, right? He was an assistant in 2007. So he's got 3 World Cup winners' medals.
Yeah. And again, like, him and Nienaber were as strong a coaching team, like as a duo, as a double act, as has ever existed in rugby.
Yeah.
And probably ever will exist in rugby, right? He's so unmistakably and so unapologetically South African in everything.
Absolutely.
You know, that like clearly his biggest passion above his love for rugby and coaching rugby is he's very proud to be South African. Yeah. In the way that he talks, the way that he addresses everything in the media. And above all, like, the way that he gets his rugby teams to play, the first thing he does when he gets the dream job, his immediate thought is, right, what's a South African team look like? It has a big pack, it kicks a lot, and it wins tight games.
As he says in Chasing the Sun too, right? Siya Kolisi is not the biggest thing in South Africa. South Africa is the biggest thing in South Africa. And the goal, the motivation the whole time wasn't about the Springboks and the jersey. It was about the nation and the land and the people, you know. And how many times have we seen Siya Kolisi as the kind of figurehead, the on-the-pitch manifestation of what the Rassie Erasmus era is about, talk about fans who can't afford tickets to games rather than just the guys in the stands, you know, to people watching on TV or people crowded around in cafes and pubs and bars watching games on screens. And that feels very much at the heart of everything they do. You know? And a lot of this has come through right from his entire career, right? That Rassie started obviously as a player. He played back row just like Siya Kolisi. He is not remembered as an all-time great player. He was a solid, workman-like player, won 30-odd caps, won his first cap in '96 right after the World Cup triumph and retired in 2003. Around a not great World Cup campaign. He played in a sort of almost the least successful Springbok era other than the one directly before he took over as coach. And yet, it's everything he's done since. And when you read about what he was like as a player, that tells you who he's become since and kind of sets the legacy up, right?
Yeah.
There was a great piece back from about 2011 in SA Rugby magazine on Rassie Erasmus, where they interviewed people who'd played with him, and this was when he first came into the South Africa setup as what was essentially a kind of DOR position. He was sort of a technical advisor, but it wasn't yet director of rugby. a job he'd then create for himself in 2017. And people he played with would talk an awful lot about how they would go out for a coffee or a beer after a game or whatever, and they would come in and Rassie had set up a VCR in the hotel room and he recorded both their games and all the All Blacks or whoever they were playing's other games, and he'd be going through them, watching them on his own, pressing the rewind on the video button. This was before they had formal video analysis sessions, and he'd be going, you know, I think we can approach their line out there here, or I think we can attack this here, or I think their scrum isn't setting like this. And basically, there were players saying in this piece that Rassie put more attention into analysing the opposition than the coaches did when he was a player.
It's really interesting as well, because a big part of why I think he's been so successful as a coach, obviously we've talked about how emotionally intelligent he is, you know, all the stuff about, you know, you just alluding to, like, Siya Kolisi saying no one outside of South Africa understands this.
Yeah.
And, like, all the clips in Chasing the Sun of him, you know, crying over Makazole Mapimpi's backstory and him understanding the players so well. When you're discussing who's the best rugby coach of all time, rugby is fundamentally two things, right? It's such an emotional game and it's such a technical and analytical game, right? You have to be very technical in everything you do, but also in order to drive through contact and win bloody scrums and lineouts and everything, you have to be physically insanely strong and powerful and everything. And yeah, I think Rassie Erasmus, more than potentially any other rugby coach in history, has got the perfect balance of both of those two things.
I think Rassie Erasmus fundamentally, right, is more of a director of rugby than a head coach. So he, you know, started coaching in 2004, was made head coach of Free State Cheetahs at just 32, when he was younger than 4 of the players in his squad, including Oz Duran was also there at the time.
That's crazy.
I know,
and also,
imagine.
Again, like, that just does kind of tell you how much you need to know about how analytically he viewed the game, you know. And again, like, analysis is kind of the thing that he is more obsessed with than basically any coach ever.
The interesting thing is, this was something the Springboks put a video about recently as well, he's not a stats guy, right? He's obsessed with analysis and process and identifying things and tactical trends, but he isn't at all about stats, or very little about stats, you know? He's
Other than
about
battle stats.
Battle stats, right. But like, that's the thing he looks at, right? It isn't how many carries this guy make, it's how many involvements does this guy make in this short space of time as possible. Right? It's all about how do you clear out the breakdown rather than how many times are you hitting a breakdown.
You know what, that is such an interesting point, because if you think about someone like Eddie Jones, right, who is one of the, undoubtedly in the conversation of one of the best ever, in terms of the stats and who needs to be in what position, who needs to be calling what shape at what certain time or whatever, Eddie Jones will give you all of that, right? But once again, the emotional side of rugby is something that Eddie Jones always struggled with to this day, and, you know, potentially is what partially caused the train wreck of him at Australia in the 2023 World Cup. But you hear so many stories of particularly people who coach with England, but also with Japan, actually. Hirose being kind of the main example of that, kind of who was pushed under the bus. Many of the players with England have talked about him just really mistreating them.
And just being unreadable. You know, you think when Matt Giteau talked about this an awful lot, about how he just never knew what Eddie was thinking and he never knew what he wanted from him. And in some ways that can drive you on up to a point. But
Eddie Jones is essentially a robot. You know, he's a rugby genius robot.
But the thing about Rassie, right, is he is incredibly, in a very specific way, emotionally intelligent at getting the best out of these players.
That's
right.
it.
There's a story about Pieter-Steph du Toit and how Pieter-Steph du Toit, before Rassie came in, was a good player. You know, he was a very good second row who wasn't really working in the back row. And then something happened over the space of about 6 months and he became the best flanker in the world. And it just like almost changed overnight. It's an interesting thing that he said that one of the biggest things that happened for him that changed his career was Rassie telling him to every defensive set, imagine that his son is waiting behind the defensive line. And so suddenly he is flying up and giving everything. And it's why so often Pieter-Steph du Toit looks like he's on the brink of tears.
That is so interesting because, again, with the Eddie Jones-Rassie Erasmus comparison, if you view rugby, and, you know, we're all guilty of this at some point, but if you view rugby as just a game of chess or as a video game, right, then Eddie Jones is your, you know, all-time greatest rugby coach. And not just Eddie Jones, but also you can look at...
There's plenty of them out there.
Exactly. However, if you look at it as people have sacrificed everything in their lives from being children playing this game to be here, they spend every day on the training paddock or in the gym, they have to then go home to their families and eat the appropriate things to get into the stage where they're an elite athlete, just preparing for the test match on a Saturday. If you bring all of that extra kind of like context into it, then Rassie Erasmus is the one who prepares them to be that guy.
However, I think the interesting thing with Rassie, he comes in, starts coaching when he's 32 as a head coach instantly. His second season, The Cheetahs win the Currie Cup for the first time in 29 years. The first time since the 70s. So he makes a huge impact instantly. Is instantly brought in to coach the Cheetahs Super Rugby side and does a pretty decent job. You know, they improve on the performance of the previous year, but they still don't finish like playoff positions or anything. And after that is then brought into the South African setup to oversee things. So this is a brilliant technical guy. We'll get him in to oversee the small bits alongside Eddie Jones, who then comes in as a lot of the kind of defence and broader coaching. And he does a great job there, then has 4 years, and it's a weird 4 years for Rassie when you read up on it, where he sort of floats around, right? And he's with the Stormers for a bit, he's with South Africa for a bit, he kind of goes back and forth, he ends up consulting at various Currie Cup teams, and then it's only in 2011 that I think his kind of legacy begins and everything that he is now begins. Because one of the things, right, is he goes to Munster in 2016.
Yes.
And this is where he kind of makes his name as head coach, really, to the wider world, to most of the rugby world. He does an incredible job at Munster. He turns that club around from a team that had gone from being greats, one of the best teams in Europe, to being a mid-table side. And he took them back at the top, and they lost the final. But like the way he just got Munster fans behind them, the way that season kind of meant so much to an awful lot of Munster fans.
Yeah, in the most difficult circumstances with the unfortunate death of Anthony Foley as well, which is what got him promoted into that job.
So that was it. He was brought in to be director of rugby with Foley as head coach.
Yeah.
Right? Because he was viewed as a director of rugby at the time. He's viewed as one of the most promising directors of rugby in the game. However, the absolutely tragic death of Axel Foley the day before a game led to him being brought in to be head coach and director of rugby. And he then brought in as well with him Jacques Nienaber to be defence coach. And that very much laid the foundations down. He met Felix Jones while he was there, who was an assistant at Munster, former Munster player, who then went on to coach with the Springboks. He brought over with him. Likewise, Alice Walters was there. He had been with Scarlets, then gone to Munster. And he brought a lot of that staff over because they worked well as a unit to the Springboks from that Munster period. However, I think a big part of it is the lead-in from 2011 to him getting that job with Munster. Those 5 years are, as much as anything, what laid the foundations, because you've got what he did in position with South Africa in sort of 2011 to 14, and then you've got him forming this new team and this new style of playing with him as head coach, with Jacques there, with Felix Jones there, with Alex Walters as conditioning coach, etc. That whole unit kind of form as a group with Munster.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so interesting the way that translates, isn't it? The way that, as I say, Rassie being such an emotionally intelligent guy, and he will look at a team and think, how should this team play? Yeah. And I guess on one hand you can draw parallels between your typical Munster team and your typical Springbok team, which is probably a big part of it.
I think that is. I think that's a big part of why he was a perfect fit for that. But in the lead up to this, right, 2011, Rassie Erasmus comes in with the South African Rugby Union, and his job is to oversee high performance, everything building up to the Springbok national team and below. Performance rugby, where it isn't about having fun and taking part, it's about winning, right? Anything that falls in that umbrella is Rassie Erasmus's job. And so he sets up, right, and it's funny, he was asked about what the proudest moment of his career was it winning the World Cup? And he said, no, the proudest moment of his career wasn't the actual winning the World Cup, it was the players scoring the tries and creating the tries, being Lukhanyo Am, Makazole Mapimpi, Cheslin Kolbe, Bongi Mbonambi, right? Yeah. Because they are all a product of the EPD, the Elite Player Development Programme, that he put in place in 2011 when he came in charge, right? So...
You crafty sod, Rassie.
During that period, South African rugby, and indeed the 20 years beforehand, was very, very conscious of its racial history, of that situation. And Rassie's approach was, we shouldn't have a quota system as happened in cricket, as was discussed widely in rugby. We shouldn't be looking at treating players differently at the base of the skin. What we should be doing is making sure we have the pathways in place that the most talented, most able, most physically gifted and rugby brain gifted athletes from all backgrounds have equal opportunity to get into professional pathways. So he set up two things. He set up the EPD and he set up what's now known as the Moby squad, or the Moby unit, which now Dwayne Vermeulen heads up, which essentially is a group, a team, which at the time he was in charge of initially, of elite coaches who travel the entire country and provide coaching input at all levels, right? So they go from the Super Rugby teams at the time, they're now the URC teams, right down to local school sides, not even the elite schools that kind of had rugby pathway systems, right down to like bog standard state schools.
Wow, okay.
So he set up a brand new coaching network A lot of the players in this current Springbok squad come from completely outside the traditional pathways that were set up, that all of the Springbok squad came from 15, 20 years ago. So you look at currently Answer as a great example, right? Mm-hmm. He played his first game of professional 15-a-side rugby at age 25, right? He was a Springbok at 26. He's now 28. That. So he was picked up playing in a fairly standard school sevens tournament, right? Pre-Rassie Erasmus programs, and in most countries in the world, there wouldn't have been scouts, there wouldn't have been coaches at those sevens tournaments between local schools. But they had one, and they went, this kid is outstanding, and they brought him into a sevens development program. And from there, he ends up playing, I think, Western Province under-21s, and then getting into Blitzbok off the back of that.
Okay, but how cool is that? As people who've grown up watching rugby in England, where it's very much the case that if you're not at a certain type of school, playing in a certain way, and at a certain type of club, frankly, by a certain age, you're simply not going to happen.
No.
You know, is generally the attitude. And there are very, very few exceptions who get through and are late developers, you know. It's very, very rare in this part of the world that happens. That is so cool for Curtly Anderson. Not only he managed to get to a professional level, but also got to the Springboks and won a World Cup.
Played the
all
World Cup
inside
final. Almost scored the World Cup final. But like, you've coached a player, right, who's got into Leicester Tigers Academy from that development pathway, and it's so prescriptive, you know? They don't have coaches out at every game, at every occasion. I think the idea of this, in theory, is that any player with the talent can get spotted at some point.
Sure.
You know?
Sure.
So like Lekanyuam was playing for the Borders team, who at the time were in administration, they were failing, they were like the lowest level of professional rugby. And he had like, again, you look at Lekanyuam's career, right? And we did that video on Lekanyuam a couple of years ago now.
Yeah.
And he spent a period with Saracens without playing a game. Like, he was floating around as an average professional rugby player.
That's so strange, because I just wouldn't have known that.
It was the Moby squad, the Moby unit, who went and identified him, who went, this kid has something, from going and watching him in training rather than watching him play games. And when actually, if we get him to the right environments, and they went in, they changed the way that they coached him personally and identified him and brought him into Super Rugby programs. And from there, he then becomes one of the best players in the world.
Yeah.
There was a period where he possibly was the best player in the world.
Definitely there was a period where he was, Yeah.
Bongi Mbonambi likewise, right?
Yeah.
So Bongi Mbonambi came through, he was spotted playing by this team, playing university rugby at a team outside of the top division, right? So in England, you do get players picked up from playing Bucks Super Rugby, which is a 10-team competition for the elite kind of university programs, are basically the next step down from professional academies.
Yeah.
So you have a few players.
It's a great standard of rugby.
Yeah. You have a handful of players who slip between the cracks, who then get picked up to play pro rugby there.
Yeah, so the likes of like Alex Donbrandt is kind of the biggest, most
the headline,
high-profile name. Like Luke Northmore from Harlequins is another kind of big.
But it's been a great thing for the Welsh regions on lower budgets lately, right? Is they've brought in a lot of Buck Super Rugby players.
Yeah.
You know, you've seen Osprey, Scarlets, and Cardiff have all like really raided that as a source of getting cheaper quality players. He wasn't playing in that top division; he was playing outside of that, and was then spotted by the EPD program, and they brought him in to the Bulls, and then with that, he then went and played for the University of Pretoria Tucks program, one of the traditional universities where players come through. So Henry Pollard played for them, for instance. And
he did all right for himself.
He did all right. So Pollard came through the completely conventional system, right?
Yeah.
Of like age-grade pathways, university rugby,
played at Paarl, didn't he? Which was one of the big names.
Schools.
Yeah.
Dylan van der Merwe was at school with as well.
Of course.
And what happened to him? You know, he didn't kick on from South Africa into 20,
Well,
did
he was actually raised in Scotland, and he was just there on a gap year.
Yeah. Aka van der Merwe qualified in residency recently, though. So
South Africa. Yeah.
But this whole system,
he's from Manchester, that's why he played for Sale.
This whole system was set up by Rassie Erasmus because he identified they were missing huge amounts of talent. And he has led them to a situation, right? South Africa and France, the only two nations in the world with over 1,000 professional rugby players, right? England's got sort of 300, 400 odd. Ireland and Wales have each got about 150 to 200. And then you've got plenty of others in that sort of similar ballpark. However, what he's managed to do is make sure they aren't just giving those spots out to the 1,000 best rugby players. They're going and finding guys who deserve to be in that situation.
And challenging the people at the bottom of that pool as well. You know, it sounds horrible, but if you think of like something like the NFL, which is probably the most high performance sports league in the world. I guess like the Premier League.
It's the Premier League and the NFL, yeah.
But those two anyway. You look at any time you hear about anybody kind of trying to crack the NFL, and I'm not saying this for any particular rugby player that we might know about. I can't remember who that guy is anyway.
Yeah, Jordan Pataya.
Yeah, Jordan Pataya, Harry Mallender. Anyway.
Derek Leader.
Those positions are so hotly contested that literally you can make 3 appearances, be outstanding in all of them and still not make the cut, you know? And again, like you look at South African rugby, those people kind of like at the bottom of these professional squads, right, are constantly being challenged. Like my place is up for grabs here. Like there are a load of people playing top end amateur levels in South Africa that could take this, or even not the top end amateur levels, you know, because as you say, that this Moby squad is going around and checking absolutely everybody who is eligible to play for South Africa.
And the other thing is, right, this is also being used to develop coaches as well. Coaches have been put in the pathway. The first coach to go through it was this guy. I'm just going to check my notes here because just to get his name right. It's Jacques Nienaber.
Nienaber. Yeah, I've heard of him.
Heard of him. I think he did all right. Who infamously was Rassie's mate, who he met in army, and then from there he went like, "Oh, you think about rugby the same way I do," and brought him through the system as a coach.
What were the chances?
But the point was, right, they had someone in this unit for every element of it. So Rassie looked at line-out breakdown and overall game strategy. You had someone looking at kicking. You had someone looking at game management and backline play. You had Nienaber looking at defence. And you had Peter de Villiers looking at scrummaging, right? Almost all those coaches have gone on to coach at international level now, at very, very high standard. And they were being brought in to coach at school levels, but they were also overseeing the other professional teams. And they were going in and doing like clinics and talking to players individually and being able to witness training and see how players train differently and so on. So this brought up the standard enormously. So when they first went to Munster and said, "We want to bring you back," his kind of first statement was, "I want to be director of rugby more than I want to be head coach." So they initially brought him in to be head coach. They then sack Alistair Gauthier shortly afterwards, and he becomes head coach, and he becomes both of them. Well, that's sort of always been the way that he wants to be director of rugby first, and he wants to put pathways in place first and look at that and identify players. The thing is, he's just so good at motivating players, talking to players and working through that it's a waste to not have him as head coach as well.
Sure. If they could have 2 Rossies, then you know, that would be the ideal scenario. But I think he's got the next best thing in Nienaber, in somebody who is equally adept, again, at both the technical and tactical, the DOR and the head coach stuff, that they balanced each other out very, very nicely.
He then goes away, right? He motivates his team uniquely well. He's a brilliant technical coach. He set up these pathways to bring these players through. He wins the 2019 World Cup, right? They then have 4 years of being good. As I say, they win the games that matter. They win the Lions series. They beat the All Blacks a handful of times, including their biggest ever win over them. They go into that 2023 World Cup and they're no longer favourites, right? And we've talked about this before off air, but I think generally the team that wins the World Cup is a team who reflects what rugby is at that moment, right?
Yes.
So you look at 2019, it was a game about patience. And the most patient team tends to win games. And it was about holding your nerve and playing long phases of possession or long phases of kicking and trying to win games. It's why Wales were so good under Gatland that year. You look at 2015, the best attacking team won. That was New Zealand, so they won it. 2007, it was all about line out, kicking, scrum. So South Africa won it. Typically, that's always been the case. Is a team that reflects what the game is at the time wins the World Cup. I think 2023 is one of the few outliers where that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
Where I think rugby was about attacking on the first couple of phases. And instead, South Africa won it based on defence and kicking.
And I think both 2019 and 2023 have slightly refuted what we all thought was the dominant force in rugby at a certain time. There is a famous quote from Mike Tyson, which is, "Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face."
Yes.
Which is kind of what I view the 2019 era of the Springboks to have been, that they came up against both that Wales and that England side in the semi and the final, and they went, great, let's see what you've got. Try and out-scrummage Frans Malherbe.
Yeah.
Try and out-maul us here when we've got Lou Diacher in the middle of it bullying you, Try and run it back at us when you're having to run an extra 10 metres because Andre Pollard's kicked it over your head, And it is as simple as that. If we are bigger and more difficult to tackle than you, how are you gonna run this game plan against us?
Yeah. But I also think the 2019 team developed that patience and accuracy.
They did.
And you look at Handré Pollard talk about that Wales semi-final as his favourite game he's ever played in. At the time, he talked about it as that. I think that's now been overtaken by the semi-final he played afterwards.
Sure.
But he basically said, because it was the most interesting tactical game, we knew Wales' entire game plan was they were happy to wait 80 minutes for us to make one mistake in the 79th minute.
Yeah.
Right? So what we had to do was make sure we didn't make that mistake, and we played nothing. We shut the game down and we didn't play our usual tactics, and we just became the most patient team in the world. And in the end, Wales made the mistake on 77 minutes.
Yeah.
Because South Africa forced them into it. As you say, an incredibly physically dominant moment where they just couldn't hold out anymore.
Yeah. And to bring this back to Rassie, one thing which I guess became apparent to everybody in that World Cup win, which has only become more and more so since, is, as I say, there is this whole big is beautiful kind of narrative to the Springboks, but it is the way in which they use it. So the one moment I think most people think of, other than the tries from that 2019 final, is the move.
Yes.
Where on second phase they run a full 8-man maul to just target one or two members of the England pack, draw a penalty from it, kick for the posts. And I feel like that use of how can we best utilise having the best pack in the world, how can we best exploit the fact everyone else doesn't have the biggest pack in the world, that is what sums up Rassie Erasmus and Jacques Nienaber for me.
Yeah. I think so much of it is lateral thinking and coming up with new ways to make old ideas work.
Yeah.
Right? That is kind of how I define the Rassie approach. It is taking things that are traditional and finding new ways to do them.
Which is the reason why, come sort of let's say the 2021 Lions tour, which was so hotly contested and so just intense generally. By that point, analysts knew the Springbok game plan inside out and still couldn't beat it.
Yeah.
Because of the ingenuity of this coaching team, One thing which, I know that we're talking about Rassie here rather than Jacques Nienaber, but one of the things that best defines this, which obviously, as I say, 2019, you look at the scrum, you look at the maul, you look at the kicking game, right? And I think in the 4 years after that, those obviously were still primary things, but the out to win defence was kind of what defined the Springboks even more so than those other things. For example, there's this example here where Ireland try and run a kind of one of the most popular attacking plays at the moment, still to this day, against them, which is hitting 12 on a long ball, 10 then slides into the boot with 13 running a hard line. And then the idea is the opposition has to drift really hard to get around it, and so you should get to an edge quite easily. However, Jesse Creel makes an outstanding read here, comes up, really forces the pass from Mac Hansen, forces him to rush it a little bit, and Hugo Keenan ends up getting nailed by Makazole Mapimpi. However, South Africa kind of want Hansen to throw the long ball here over the top to an unmarked man on the wing because they have that marked, right? They have Sia Khaleesi and Peter Steph Dutoy and Damien Dealande all running that kind of horizontal defence. Obviously, a rugby defensive line is meant to come up, vertically, but you can go sideways and cover them because a pass over the top like that will take much longer to reach its target, That they cover all bases with that kind of defence. And that is what's defined him in the 4 years kind of leading on from that up to the 2023 World Cup.
Yeah. When we look back in 50 years' time, I think the biggest legacy of this era of the Springboks, from a tactical point of view, will be the catch-up defence.
Yes.
Right? Which they introduced. Sia Khaleesi is the best at it in the world.
Yeah.
Where he will be in a kind of inside position and he will instantly, the moment the ball gets outside him, hair it to the wing and get there and make a cover tackle. And it means you can be incredibly aggressive. You don't have to drift and cover the space. It completely changed how teams defend. And it kind of feels, the moment it came in, a bit like the All Blacks introducing the 1-3-3-1 before that. A bit like you go right back to Roy Francis creating the defensive line in the 1950s, right? And before that, they just stood in random positions. And he was like, no, guys, we should stand in a straight line here.
Game changer.
Absolute game changer. And it feels like one of those moments, one of those things that we'll look at and go, yeah, why wasn't everyone always doing that? That's ridiculous.
I think one thing which is a mark of Rassie Erasmus as a head coach is, as I say, he won 2019 and kind of doubled down, but very, very slightly and subtly evolved the way that he wanted the team to play.
Yeah.
After 2023, he has realised that you will be very, very lucky if rugby is played the same way at international level for more than 8 years, right? That I think defence has kind of been king in men's international rugby for the last 8 years or so. And you can probably tell, looking at how these cycles tend to go, by the next World Cup, chances are attack will be in fashion again.
The next World Cup is being played in the Australian summer.
Yeah.
Right? It's going to be played in heat, in very different conditions to France in the autumn. And Japan as well, which played in typhoon season, right?
Of course.
Like, we are
Sue them
looking
for that.
at a World Cup being played, no doubt, in hot conditions, in warm weather, on dry pitches. That is, I think, fueling in part his thinking. But the other side of it is, he knows this Springbok defence, teams have had a pretty decent go at figuring it out, and we sometimes see set moves that are absolutely brilliant that exploit it and pull it out, right?
Yeah.
And I think Rassie knows this defence can only be on top for so long, and they need more to the game.
It's also the most knackering style of play to play in heat.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. So what's happened over the last year is he's brought in Tony Brown. He's specifically gone looking, not for the best attack coach in the world, but someone innovative who works with squads of players specifically, right? Yeah. So what Tony Brown did when he was in New Zealand, his teams were broadly innovative and came up with new patterns, new ways of playing. But when he went to Japan, that was the thing that really sold them, because he came with a completely new way of playing, built around having a small, light pack who were quick and using like pace to carry instead of raw power as the way of creating an attack, right? And what Tony Brown's done is he's done that, but with big bodies instead. He's done kind of the exact inverse. And he's creating, in the process, a brand new way of attacking. And this was, like, credit goes to Tony Brown for what he's doing at the minute. But it was Rassie spotting this and going, we need to evolve, we need to change ahead of the curve, right? And I think in terms of trends over this year of Test rugby, we've got obviously a handful of games to go in the autumn. But as the first year post-World Cup, the biggest trend has been, I think everyone is keeping hold of the ball for longer periods of possession than they were last year. Where broadly, if you got beyond phase 4 and you hadn't scored, your chance of scoring went down phase on phase, right? So you want to kick the ball away if you got to that position. France almost never played beyond 3 phases. They were constantly trying attacking kicks once they got to phase 4. And they were kind of the mode for attacking teams.
Yeah.
And what we saw as well was Ireland preferring to play with possession, and that caught them out in the end, right?
Yeah.
Like, them wanting to play with possession cost them points in that quarter-final, and they didn't get beyond it. And this year, that started to swing back round. And my gut says it isn't swinging back round because someone's got a tactical reason for it yet, but because teams know it's going to happen, so they're trying to find the best way to do it.
I know what you mean, like manifesting it a little bit. Yeah.
Everyone's going, okay, we know this is coming. We know this change is coming. We know it's going to be more attack-based by 2027. We want our version to be that.
Yeah.
And we've actually seen teams that are less attack-based. The likes of Wales, the likes of Joe Schmidt sides, in Australia. Warren Gatland and Joe Schmidt are very conservative coaches. Their teams are not doing so well, right? Rassie should be in that ballpark, but he saw this coming in advance. Yeah. And he's then brought in the best attack coach for this system to get these players playing a new way and given him complete free rein to go mad. And so we've seen the Springboks trying those like chips backwards over the scrum half, and we've seen them trying these mad line-out moves that no one else
lifting
been playing.
2 pods, the thing of them switching it back onto the blind side with Gumazulu, like running that blind little thing. Khaleesi leaving them all, doing the little switch with Dale Lande. There's so many plays they've done with this,
I think it's an absolutely genius move to try and get ahead of the game because your plan B is better than most teams' plan A.
It's no longer just about punching someone in the face.
No.
Now he's got a shiny rainbow-coloured glove on, which is in the opposition's head.
Socks.
Yes, exactly. Look, I've taken this analogy too far, but point is, the Tony Brown attack is not something that's too ambitious for the game plan that they've been playing previously, And obviously these are all world-class players, so they will be able to execute it. But you look how far they've lent into, for example, like using Peter Steph du Toit as an edge forward, which is always something they've done a little bit, and it always worked. But, leaning into like his one-handed offloading, his carrying against smaller men to always get over the gain line and launching plays off there. This is a great example here where they take off the exact play that was on about earlier, Ireland running. They take this one step further and they throw an extra skip pass to Jesse Creel at outside centre. This is like a good 30 metres. Ryan Ash lobs this here. Farsi runs the hard line. Libok takes that in the boot and is already squaring up against Carreras on the wing for Argentina. Am runs a little cheat line so he gets the breakdown first. And again, they are taking what are pre-existing, well-established, well-ran attacking plays, but he's being innovative in a way that oppositions won't see coming, which isn't something that the previous Springboks have had to do.
You look at Sia Khaleesi in the World Cup carried 8 times over the entire tournament. He's now averaging 6 carries a game. They have completely changed the way they're playing and they're getting so much more out of a lot of their players.
Damain Delande is a man who's passing more and is doing much more in the breakdown. He's getting ridiculous turnovers now this year.
Yeah.
they have the personnel, they can do this. They can evolve their attack.
However, all of this leaves us with, I think, one big question, right? Which is, where does Rassie Erasmus sit in the pantheon of the greatest ever rugby coaches?
This is an interesting one because I don't want this to become a 2015, 2011 All Blacks versus 2019, 2023 Springboks thing. Because I think they're very, very different teams, very different eras. Not very different eras, slightly different eras. Yeah. The All Blacks won their World Cups kind of at more of a canter, but the Springboks won theirs in a more competitive era for international rugby where they had more competition to kind of like take those World Cups from them, which makes it more impressive. The thing is, in terms of sheer results, who would take Rassie in a final? You know, who would stop him from winning a trophy in a final? It's hard to tell.
I think the 2015 All Blacks team are the best team I've ever seen. I think the current Springbok team are the best cup team I've ever seen. If I enter them into a tournament, I expect them to win anything. Yeah. Where, even against the 2015 All Blacks, where if you put the 2015 All Blacks like at a run of 20 random games, I'd expect them to win more of them than the modern Springboks.
And by more points.
However, the thing about Rassie Erasmus, right, I think there is enough evidence now over his run with the Springboks, with everything he's done in terms of those 2 World Cups, in terms of now this Rugby Championship title, and in terms of the way he's evolved this team slowly over the course of a long time. And also you then throw in all the development he's done, his time with Munster, his time with the Cheetahs, time with everything. If you take all of that, I think there is enough to say he is the best rugby coach of all time. But much like the thing I said about Antoine Dupont, right? I think Antoine Dupont is the best rugby player I've ever seen. I understand people being hesitant to call him the greatest because he hasn't won a World Cup. He hasn't gone over and done X, Y, Z, right? But I think Antoine Dupont is on pure ability the best player I've ever seen.
Sure.
I think Rassie is the best coach we've ever seen in rugby union. However, he has only done it with one nation, right? And if you look at the coaches that I would consider in the absolute pantheon,
South Africans are going to love that, by the way.
Right. But this is the thing, right?
Go do it with Namibia, Rassie.
Yeah. But the thing is, right, Graham Henry improved Wales and New Zealand and won a World Cup. Eddie Jones improved Ireland and Wales and Wasps, like exponentially. He took Wasps from being a relegation contender to double European champions.
This is a really interesting thought.
Eddie Jones, you know, Japan, Australia and England.
Australia.
I know, Australia. First one for Australia. He took them to the World Cup final, you know.
Yeah. It's just funny now when you mention that.
Yeah. But those kind of, you know, and then you have the likes of Rod McQueen, Brian Lahore, Kitch Christie with South Africa, who did brilliant job, you know, right down to like Marcelo Alfredo with Argentina, Pablo Lemoyne with Chile and Uruguay, you know, endless coaches, Carwyn James way back in the day, who did, there's also an All Blacks coach I want to mention, who lost one game in a 10-year run with the All Blacks, who's called Dick Everest. I wouldn't recommend Googling the name Dick Everest. This is your Everest, boys. But there are plenty of coaches who've done incredible jobs with one nation. And I think Rassie is the greatest of those ever.
Yeah.
But I think there is a question of, was he lucky that he got the South African mindset perfectly? Right?
I think that is definitely part of it, and that is perfectly legit.
I think that's perfectly fine.
Because on one hand, I'm sure he would do a pretty good job with whoever else he wants to coach. On the second hand, I couldn't see him coaching anybody else at international level.
It'd be weird.
On the third hand, he doesn't need to, because why would you when he can win another World Cup?
Yeah. Why would he leave South Africa, and why would South Africa let him go?
Yeah, exactly. Because he's done literally the perfect job. Yeah. You know, he's 2 World Cups from 2 as DOR, you know, or head coach, or whatever coach he was at the time. You know?
I suspect it'll take it would probably take 5 years of them falling off massively. Yeah. Because I don't think one season of things not going well will be enough for them to fire him. Even a World Cup where they don't get the pool stage, I think they keep him on.
Yeah. He's done too much for them.
Yeah.
You know?
But I do think I'm too curious about how we do it in another nation and what that would look like.
I'd love to see it. I'd love to see how we deal with like Russia or something.
Yeah.
You know?
Or even a team like Wales or Australia at the minute.
Yeah. You know? Yeah. How about, yes, we'll go with that. Yes, he should go to Wales.
Yeah.
He should come and coach Wales. That would be really good. Yeah.